Hi, I'm going to talk a little bit about classification of birds and also about species definitions and some other topics around phylogenies. So one of the first things to understand when we start observing our birds and looking through our field guides even is that birds are organized in a classification system. This is based on a very old classification system prior to a lot of what we understand about bird relationships. And this is the Linnaean classification system. So, and there are this is a nested classification system. It starts with domain, and then we still use the concept of kingdom in many cases. And so birds are animals, they're in the animal kingdom. And then on down to phylum. Birds are in phylum Chordata. And then to class, birds are in class Aves. And then once we get to the class that's Aves, it's important to start to understand these smaller levels, increasingly smaller levels of classification, including order, family, genus, and species. Okay, and as we, and it's important to understand these because you can actually understand something about relationships of birds. It actually helps you with your bird identification. If you see certain traits in a bird that might be completely new to you and you say, okay, you know, I'm pretty sure that bird is some kind of a duck. I'm going to look up ducks in my field guide. And because field guides, most field guides are arranged in taxonomic order, you know where to turn in your field guide to find the ducks. And so some basic things to understand when you're looking at classification of birds, of vertebrates, this holds true for the most part, is order names usually end in O-R-M-E-S, ormes. So if you see that name and somebody says, what level of classification is that? And it's any kind of funny beginning part of the word with the ending O-R-M-E-S, you can be confident. And it's usually formes. You can be confident that that is the order level of classification. And so, for example, this duck that we may all recognize as a mallard is in order Anseriformes. And the order Anseriformes has within it smaller taxonomic units, including 3 families: the Anserinatidae, the Anhimidae, and the Anatidae. And the Anatidae is the family that contains ducks and geese. And the other 2 are really interesting families that we don't find in North America. But if you follow then family Anatidae, nested within that family are several genera. Okay, so birds, we're grouping birds into smaller and smaller groupings. And here are some of the genus that names that you would find in North American Anatidae, North American birds that are ducks. Ace, so that's the wood duck is in that genus. Aetha, Mergus, those are your mergansers. Anis, which are your dabbling ducks, plus 45 others. Ducks are pretty diverse. And so if you follow genus Anis, then you get down to the level of species. And something to know about when I say, what is the species name of the mallard? You're always going to have 2 words that form the species name: the genus name and what they call the specific epithet. You'll never just name that second word as the name for the species, because there are lots of species that may have the name Platyrhynchus, for example. So the mallard is Anis platyrhynchus. And there are lots of different different animals that may have Platyrhynchus as their species name, but no other animal has that, their specific epithet, but no other animal is named Anis platyrhynchus. So it's that combination of the genus name and the species name that makes the naming unique. And so that's Linnaean classification. Now, the goal of evolutionary biology and taxonomy is to try as much as possible to align the classification with what we understand about evolutionary relationships. And so we'll see when we update our taxonomy in the form of checklists and other organizations of names for animals, that names get updated. You might see a genus name for a bird change, or a bird may end up being in a different order than initially it was thought to be. These often aren't huge changes, but they are slight rearrangements based on new information about their evolutionary relationships of birds. So, what does actually make a species a species? People are often really interested in this. And I'm going to use an example from the book on a little brown bird that we can, one of which we can find in the campus forest at Evergreen. It's called the Pacific wren. But up until about 9-10 years ago, it was thought to be a bird called the winter wren. And the winter wren was thought to have this, what we call whole Arctic distribution. It was found mostly in the northern latitudes in certain types of habitats, but found in North America, Europe, and Asia. And the birds look almost identical to one another. They look almost completely identical to one another. There are some variations, geographic variations with the habitat, but they don't follow any kind of pattern that you would determine as species. People that observe these birds in different regions may have noticed that there seem to be slight differences in their songs, but wrens have very large vocal repertoires, and so it's hard to know if the differences were due to some biological thing or some other pattern that was not related to their species. So researchers started studying this bird, and they applied a couple of species concepts to determine if the Pacific wren was the winter wren was a single species, or if it really was made up of more than one species, what we call a cryptic species. So one species concept that has been around for a long time is called the biological species concept. And you would learn this in a college level introductory biology class about different kinds of species concepts. The biological species concept states that species that are different populations that have diverged, when they come back into contact with one another, so different species that are coming into contact with one another, if they're really truly different species, they will not be able to successfully interbreed with one another. So there may be barriers to breeding. There might be differences in the timing of breeding. There may be parts that don't fit together, so breeding isn't successful. There may be egg and sperm incompatibility. There might be a lot of reasons, but breeding isn't successful, or offspring have reduced vigor, so they don't do as well as the non-hybrids. And so that is basically the crux of biological species concept. And it's a very useful concept, but it can't be applied to every situation. It can't be applied to species or different populations that ranges don't overlap. You can't just put them into a false setting like a zoo or a captive breeding area and expect what happens there to reflect what actually would happen in nature. And there are actually animals that break those rules, such as ducks. Ducks in even a different genus can interbreed with one another and produce viable offspring that seem to do just fine. So there are violations of that concept, and all the species concepts that have been proposed have their problems. And so it's useful to use multiple concepts when you're looking to see if something's a good species. Another concept that's very prominent now is the phylogenetic species concept. And basically it states that if two populations have uniquely different traits that are found only in their populations and not in other populations, and appear to be on different evolutionary trajectories, then those are good phylogenetic species. There are sometimes problems with that concept as well. It's hard to apply in some cases, but you can use a lot of different lines of evidence to look at birds and determine if they are the same or different species. Okay, and so the Pacific wren is a really great example. I'm going to show you a research paper that looked at the traits of these birds, and they applied several species, they applied both the biological and the phylogenetic in their analysis, and they determined through various lines of evidence that it was not the winter wren. There are actually 3 species, okay? And they did this by looking at the genetics of Pacific wrens. Specifically, they were looking at winter wrens and Pacific wrens. They did not really look at what's now called the Eurasian wren, but they looked at the mitochondrial DNA of these birds. They observed these birds and looked at nuclear DNA, I believe, of birds where their ranges overlapped, where we thought that they came into contact and could have interbred with one another. And then they also looked at their song. So I'm going to show you some results of this study. Oh, let me just show you the study sites again. And so here are the subspecies ranges of these, what were thought to be winter wrens. And here's a place where the eastern population, which is now considered winter wren, comes into contact with what is now considered Pacific wren. And the dots are representing sites where birds were sampled. Vocalizations were recorded and tissue samples were collected for this kind of genetic analysis. Okay. So I'm just going to scroll down and show you. They're talking about the type of genetic analysis that they conducted. So they first did a song analysis. So they took recordings of birds throughout these ranges and made what they call spectrograms. So this is a picture of Pacific wren's song. Okay, and if you've ever heard that song, it's very long, it's almost ventriloquial, it's lots and lots of notes. And so the x-axis is time and the y-axis is frequency or pitch. And these are all the different notes in the song. And they have variable songs, but you can see that they do share some certain elements between the songs. So there's certain components that get mixed up to make new songs. Okay, and so these are Western Pacificus singers. These are ones from a specific site. And then here are the birds that are now considered winter wrens. And you can see there are some differences in the way their songs look. Okay, there are all these high-speed, trill sort of sounds, similar looking notes, but the span of frequency and there's some, and the pureness of the tones is probably very different. When you look at these smudgy marks on a spectrogram, what you know that those are sort of more buzzy tones that span a larger frequency range, whereas these tones are much more narrow and more probably pure tones sort of sounding, more whistly sounding. And so there are some notable differences, and they did a multivariate analysis on lots of different songs and found that they were distinctly different. And why is this important? Well, cryptic birds like these Pacific wrens that don't have a lot of variation in their plumage, they're often using song as a very important signal, both to other individuals that are holding territories nearby and to potential mates. And so if a mate does not recognize another song as that of its own, it won't mate with a bird singing that song. So song is a very important cue to birds. It's a biological cue for breeding and territoriality. So that was one line of evidence. It and of itself, that difference, the distinct difference in a song, would not be enough to claim that that is its own species. But there were distinct differences. So that's one line of evidence, and it would be in support of something like a phylogenetic species concept. These are unique traits of these two groups. And then this is some of the genetic analysis of the birds, and this is of nuclear DNA. So this was looking at birds where their breeding ranges overlapped. And they specifically, I believe, were looking at nestling birds and seeing where their ranges overlapped, was there evidence that the eastern forms and the western forms were interbreeding with one another. And there was very strong differentiation. So even where they overlapped geographically, they were not interbreeding with one another. There was one exception that they did find. And so it wasn't a perfect break, but there was very little support for for the birds interbreeding, and so that was using the biological species concept to see if the birds might have been interbreeding. So this in and of itself also wouldn't be the only line of evidence that you would use to say that these are two species. But now we have the vocalizations that are different, and we're having evidence that they're not interbreeding with each other at the frequencies we'd expect in the areas where they overlap. Finally, they looked at the mitochondrial DNA. No, I'll show you this. They actually measured the birds, like captured them in mist nets, took some morphometric measurements, and actually in morphology, they overlapped quite a lot. And so their shapes and their appearances are very similar. There's no sort of visual signaling that's lending any evidence to speciation. And that's another map of the morphometric traits. Let's see if I can find that mitochondrial DNA here. Data. Let's see. Mitochondrial DNA. And so they looked at mitochondrial DNA, which is really good at differentiating species level relationships. It's very good. So mitochondrial DNA is DNA derived from the mitochondrion rather than the nuclear DNA, and mitochondria are inherited maternally. And so you can track different kinds of patterns, and you can also look at species level relationships using mitochondrial DNA. And there's some general rules of thumb for how differentiated the mitochondrial DNA needs to be for certain genes to consider something a new species. And basically the mitochondrial DNA evidence suggested that these were actually two unique species. Okay, and so this paper proposed that there were enough differences between the species, given that their songs were different, their mitochondrial DNA was different, and there was not much evidence of them breeding with one another where they came into contact. So there was biological species support. And so within a few years of this paper coming out, the species was broken up into two separate species. The Pacific wren, Troglodytes pacificus, where in the forests where we live in the Pacific Northwest, and then the winter wren. So that's an example drawing from those different species concepts. Okay, I'm going to share the screen again. Sharing the screen. All right, so a little bit about phylogenies. So once you know you have two species that are separate, that's sort of the sort of smallest scale evolutionary unit that we look at. We will also look at subspecies sometimes, but species are these units that we think of as fairly discrete. But species can be closely related to one another, and then they can have relationships that go further back in time. So we can try to reconstruct far back in time what the relationships of birds are. And so here is an example of an evolutionary tree of birds in the family Mimidae. These are birds that do a lot of mimicking. This includes mockingbirds and catbirds and thrashers. And this is a phylogeny that's an estimate of their evolutionary relationship. On the tips of these branches are sister taxa. And then as you go further back on the branches, you'll see groupings of birds that are related to one another, but further back in time. And so here are some terms. These are from the textbook that are useful to think about when you're looking at trees. So you have branches. Branches are lines on the phylogeny that trace the pathway of the evolutionary relationship. So there's a branch with brown trembler and a branch with gray trembler. And then there's this other branch with pearly-eyed thrasher. There are also nodes, okay, and these are, I'm circling a node right here. It's the point on the phylogeny where the branches separate, usually representing points where an ancestral lineage splits into two or more. And so if you look at this node here where brown trembler and gray trembler is, at this point in time, or at this point of the phylogeny, there was some ancestral form of something that's a trembler that led to those two lineages. okay, that led to the brown and to the gray trembler. It wasn't one or the other, it was some ancestor of them. And they split from that ancestor to become two separate species. Likewise, at this node, there was some ancestor that split and evolved to become, one group became pearly-eyed thrasher, the other split to become these tremblers, okay, which they further differentiated. So you can go back to nodes further back in time and think of those as the ancestral forms that split into different groups. Sister taxa are two groups, but not always two species, that are each other's closest evolutionary relatives, okay? Characters in systematics, that's any kind of trait that you can use to compare groups. And so characters may be skeletal characters. It may be the way that the birds build their nests. And so if we know something about these two mockingbirds, we might say, well, they share a character in common. It's a trait, and it might be something about their behavior, their morphology, their song, anything like that. Nucleotides are the basic molecular building blocks of the DNA and the RNA. And nucleotides and DNA data can form character data to build a phylogeny. And a sequence of DNA is a string of unique DNA code that people they'll use comparable genes to build phylogenies, often now multiple genes, nearly entire genomes sometimes. And then mitochondrial DNA, it's the DNA that's found not in the cells, but in the mitochondria. And mitochondria are responsible for they're sort of the energy powerhouse of a cell, and it's passed down maternally. And so people will use mitochondrial DNA for certain types of, making certain types of phylogenies, and nuclear DNA for others, because they evolve at different speeds. And so you can get differentiation at tips of branches and also in deeper nodes using different genes from these different areas of a cell. And then here's a mind-blowing image from page 18 of the text, and this is diversification of birds, of all modern birds. And so it's shown in the circle, and you'll see this with large groups, like at the class level of organization, where you have lots and lots of species. There's about 10,000 species of birds. Now, they're not all represented on this tree, but representatives from every order and every family are on this tree here. And something to notice here is, again, at the very tips are sister taxa. So but here they're naming them differently, like cuckoos and bustards and tanagers, flower peckers, okay? But the other thing to notice is that this tree, you could straighten it out. It just would take up a lot of space. And so the more ancestral birds, so the paleognaths that we're going to talk about in another presentation, so these are ostriches, rheas, emus, these are the oldest lineage of existing birds. They're found here, and they're found here at the deepest node of the phylogeny. And as you move around, it's almost like stepping higher and higher. And so each branch that branches off split from the branch before it more recently in time. And so you can follow branches. Here's a branch that's split from the paleognaths, and this includes here's another branch here that includes galliform birds as well as ducks, okay? And then you have modern birds here. And so we have this first branch, and you can actually follow this first branching over here all the way to the tips, but you can also look at the deeper level branches, and you can see it gets shallower and shallower and shallower. And so what we're looking at the very tips of all these branches are taxa that have evolved more recently in time. So people used to use the terms primitive and advanced. We don't use that anymore because all of these birds are existing today. They have been evolving constantly over time. So they're not more primitive, but they are more ancestral. They have an ancestor that goes back further in time, whereas birds lineages that you see at the very tips that have branches near the very tips have evolved more recently in time, or split from an ancestor more recently in time. So now that you know a little bit about phylogenies and bird relationships, it's just important to know that the field guides and the way that we order birds tends to try to reflect this pattern from more ancestral to more derived, with the more derived birds being found at the end of your field guide, and the birds that were more ancestral being found in the beginning. Now, depending on how old your field guide is, there may be some slight differences, but overall, these patterns tend to hold up over time. So the last thing I think you should do when you're rounding out chapter 2 is really look at that end and keep using that end piece of the chapter as you're learning your birds, as you're going out and birding. I'm just going to pull up chapter 2. Let's see if I have it up. Let's see, open. Let me pause this recording for just a second while I find it. Okay, we're back here, and here's that end part of chapter 2 I was talking about. And so, in particular, this starting on page 43, a survey of avian orders and families. And this survey goes from the most ancestral groups all the way up to the most modern groups. I'm not going to go through them in this lecture. You can go through them yourself. What I encourage you to do is, as you observe new birds, go back to this and say, okay, I know what species. I have my English name. I have my Latin name. I want to go back and see if I can find it in these orders. eBird, and there are a lot of great resources that will give you the taxonomy, but it's important to start to try to order these birds yourself. It really helps if you understand, if you have that sort of scaffolding or the foundation of understanding these basic patterns of birds somewhere in your deep memory to draw from when you go to new places to learn birds. It makes it much easier and faster, and it really helps you understand and find birds very, I think, more interesting because of the unique patterns they share with their close relatives. But you can scroll through here and you can actually start to look and see, okay, which orders of birds are here in the Pacific Northwest or in North America, wherever you are, and which ones aren't. If you have a printed up copy, you could circle it on using a digital pen or some way, and start to mark it up to make plans for what kind of orders of birds and families of birds you're going to look for. So this goes through orders and families. And so there are many, many orders and families of birds. It's important to understand that the diversity of birds, as we saw in that phylogeny, is not the same. Not every group has the same numbers of species. And in fact, about 50% of all bird species are in one order. That's Passeriformes. They're called perching birds or songbirds. Here's Passeriformes. And so starting from about page 51 all the way to 58, so 7 pages of this are passeriform birds. 50% of our bird diversity are passeriforms. And so this patterns of diversity across the taxa are not even either. So have a look and start to enjoy birds in this way.